Okay, today is 1 Corinthians chapter 7, sort of the chapter on marriage. So, good subject for us to study today. And again, we always start off with the walk in the Spirit, which is what Paul instructs every Christian to do, so that we won't carry out the desires of the flesh. We can't please God when we're in the flesh. We can please Him when we're in the Spirit. The Spirit is the one that is conforming us to the image of Christ as we walk in Him. I gave a couple of links to some things that you might be interested in. One is my Facebook page, and the other is my YouTube channel. Chapter 7, again, basic outline, reported problems 1 through 6. We've been through that. Today we start answering some of the questions. Paul answers questions that were sent to him in a letter that we don't have, so we just kind of infer the questions from Paul's answers. So today it happens to be questions about marriage. From last week, the quiz, true or false, believers should handle small claims court issues with one another within the church, not outside in public courts. That's true. We don't go to Judge Judy on TV for Christians to iron out silly small courts kinds of issues with each other. True or false, believers should live a life set apart by walking in the Spirit, so they will enjoy eternity sitting on a cloud in heaven playing a harp. First part's correct, the second part is not. What we are doing right now is walking by the Spirit so that we can demonstrate our loyalty to Christ, and so that when we go to the Bema Seat judgment of Christ, He will reward us, and those rewards will have to do with us ruling and reigning with Him in the literal physical kingdom here on the earth that will last for 1,000 years. So a lot of Christians have this crazy idea that when you die, as a Christian, you just go to heaven, you sit around on a cloud playing a harp. That is the dumbest thing ever. So don't believe that. We have an amazing life to come, eternal life to come, where we will be serving Christ and be with Him forever. True or false, it is better for a believer to remain wronged by another believer for a felony than to see a brother go to prison. Absolutely false. A felony is something that the government needs to deal with, and if that brother has committed a felony, he will face the charges of the government. We don't handle that one in the church. True or false, believers who commit sins like fornication, idolatry, adultery, homosexuality, theft, greed, drug use, fraud, or abuse of others will not go to heaven and will not enter the kingdom. That's false. I mean, it sounds totally wrong, and it is totally wrong. It is a believer who is walking in the flesh, and when we walk in the flesh, we're capable of committing any of these sins. But when we walk in the Spirit, we won't carry out these kinds of fleshly desires. The issue is not whether we'll go to heaven. We will go to heaven, and we will enter the kingdom if we walk like that, but we will not inherit the kingdom, which we've talked about before, and that's where we rule and reign with Christ. I don't know what people, Christians who are just basically enter the kingdom, will be doing during that time. It's not really discussed in Scripture. True or false, having sex with temple prostitutes doesn't matter, since Greek philosophy is that the body is basically evil, spirit is what really matters. That's false. That was kind of the Corinthians' thinking. They had brought the culture into the church, and especially Greek philosophy, this idea that the body really doesn't mean anything. It's really the spirit that matters. And that's totally opposite of what Christians have. Our body is considered to be a temple, the Holy of Holies of God. And so we do not abuse it in that kind of way. True or false, Christians should know that their bodies are limbs of the body of Christ, temples of the Holy Spirit, and have been bought with a price. And that's absolutely true. You should know that, and this is what should motivate your walk in the Spirit. All right, so 1 Corinthians 6, 12 through 20 really talked a lot about the Christian's use of his or her body for God's glory. And just kind of moving on from that, Paul begins to answer these questions about marriage. And the Corinthians had some strange ideas about these things, and they write this letter. So Paul is really responding to these. Verses 1 through 24 in 1 Corinthians 7 is the doctrine for the married. And it's a very detailed doctrine, and we really need to pay attention to that, since statistics indicate that almost half of Christians end up in divorces. And this is not God's plan for marriage, as you'll see here in chapter 7. Chapter 7, verse 1. Now concerning, this is the Greek word peride, here's a subject that he's introducing, the things about which you wrote. So this is referencing that letter that I talked about. And what they wrote was sort of here in the quotes. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. So their thinking was that if Paul is celibate and he's extremely spiritual, then we, in our marriages, we should be celibate even though we're married. And this is referred to as asceticism, and it's to release the soul from the prison of the physical body by self-denial. That is a Greek philosophy in a sense, and it's one side of the coin for Greek thinking, and it is absolutely wrong for Christians in marriage. So he says it's good for a man, they say it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Paul, what do you think about that? And he's going to tell him now. So this idea of touching a woman is not just to touch, but it is a sexual kind of a touching that they're referring to here. That Greek word is hapto, and it means basically to start a fire. And that's what they're talking about. There's a lot of euphemisms in the Bible, and this is one of them. Verse 2, but because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. Again, think back to Corinth, and it's the sort of the sex capital of the world there. It's a seaport, and they have these, it was said they had maybe 1,000 temple prostitutes available 24 hours a day. So it was a terrible place in terms of the sexual immorality. Each man is to have his own wife. And what it's saying here is to have sexual relations with his own wife, not to go to temple prostitutes for sex. They're to have sex in marriage, and is to have that with his own wife. The word in Greek for wife is gune. We get the English word gynecology, which is a woman's doctor, from that particular word. So this is the female that he is married to, and each woman is to have her own husband. That is a male that she is married to, and the man is married to a woman. Never in the Bible does it approve of or in any way indicate that homosexual marriage is ever considered good in the Bible. In fact, it is an abomination to God. So this is the doctrine of marriage: one man, one woman, one lifetime. And we had David and the others in the Old Testament. They had multiple wives, and they too were kind of following the culture. That's not a scriptural concept of multiple wives. And so as godly a man as David was, he had something like 8 or 9 wives. And this is the idea of syncretism, which is bringing the culture into one's faith, and we're not to do that. The Corinthians were doing something very similar. Verse 3, the husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. So it is saying here that the husband must continue to have sexual relations with his wife as part of the marriage contract. He is obligated, ophele, to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. She is obligated to him. Marriage contract made by vows with each other, and the contract must be consummated to be valid, that is, to have sexual relations. Verse 4, the wife does not have authority over her own body. but the husband does. And likewise, also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. This is a real tough one for current culture today, and when everybody thinks they're in charge of themselves entirely. This idea of having authority, does not have authority. She cannot exercise her power by withdrawing sex from her husband, withdrawing her own physical body from her husband. But the husband does. He has the authority over her body. And likewise, husband doesn't have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So this is equal rights regarding sexual relations in marriage. It's not authority to abuse one another. It's the biblical feminist viewpoint, which is rarely held today. Human viewpoint uses sexual relations as a reward or punishment. Celibacy, by the way, in marriage is unbiblical. Verse 5, Paul says, stop depriving one another except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So there's a perfectly good reason for this continuous sexual relations between a husband and wife. So it says stop depriving, which means to withhold sexual relations from. Me apostereo, one another except by agreement. So this is perhaps by a mutual agreement. Paul's not stating this as a commandment. He is saying this seems to be right to him. So perhaps by mutual agreement, symphonos, symphony, it's the two agreeing here, for a time, so that you may devote yourselves. This is the occupying of your time to prayer. So it's for a time, and it is for prayer, and then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So Satan is always attempting to try and get Christians to sin, especially sexually, because it is one of those things that is so blatant and so readily available. He's actually corrupted sexual relations to a terrible point. And you, because of your lack of self-control, the sexually frustrated is very vulnerable to sexual temptations, some more than others. Women and men face the same kinds of things. So number one, it's by mutual agreement that you would stop having sex with one another. Number two, it is a specific agreed upon time, a short time. And number three, it's for a higher spiritual purpose, which here was prayer. So there can be other circumstances where sexual relations just aren't possible, maybe a military deployment, maybe an illness or something of that nature. But under normal circumstances, husband and wife should have a regular sexual relations, and that's dependent on each couple individually. There's no set number of times or anything like that. Number 6, but this I say by way of concession, not of command. So this is by way of joint understanding, is what he's saying, and it's not by an order from me. Our bodies first belong to God to glorify Him, and secondly to our spouses for sexual intimacy. So yet I wish, verse 7, yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. So his desire or wish, is that all men were even as I. Paul was unmarried at the time, we know that, but there's an interesting thing to kind of look at here. He says that they were even as I myself am. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner and one in another. Paul's gift was celibacy. So he had no sexual desire. His singleness allowed him to devote his life 100% to the ministry of the gospel, traveling and proclaiming and teaching the word as an apostle. So celibacy is a rare gift, and you can't force it on someone. Roman Catholic priesthood is one of those areas that is forced upon a man. And this is a cause for a lot of problems within the Catholic priesthood. Verse 8, But I say to the unmarried and to widows that it is good for them if they remain even as I. So this is the doctrine of remarriage. I say to the unmarried, this is the agamos. These are widowers, men whose spouse has died. Unmarried is not a very good translation of that word. And to the widows, these are the women whose spouse has died. So you have widowers and widows, that it is good for them even if they remain even as I. So there's a suggestion here that Paul was a widower, and he's identifying with that group. Men and women whose spouse has died. So Paul may have been married, his spouse died, and so he would be in this group, and it allows that person or Paul to dedicate the rest of their lives to serving the Lord without the having to split up time between the spouse and serving the Lord. So there's a good suggestion here that Paul may have been married at one time. Verse 9, but if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. So he's still talking about widows and widowers. And if they don't have that power over oneself regarding sexual desires, they don't have the gift of celibacy, he says, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn, remain sexually aroused, if you will, and be totally frustrated with that. So they're free to not marry or to marry. Verse 10, but to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband. Okay, this is the doctrine of divorce coming up. And you can find some additional information on this about what the Lord said in Mark 10, verses 2 through 11. He says, but to the married I give these instructions. I'm announcing these instructions, but it's actually coming from the Lord. That the wife should not leave the husband. In other words, should not divorce her husband. But if she does leave, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. So this is pretty clear. If a wife does divorce her husband, she is to remain unmarried. And her only option then is to remain unmarried or to reunite with her original husband if he is alive. And the same goes for the husband. He is not to divorce his wife. It's not actually even an option for the Christian husband. The wife, if divorced, there's no remarriage or reconciled to the husband really has no option to divorce. He is to remain unmarried and to reconcile with her. Divorce for immorality is often quoted as a reason for being able to divorce, and I used to hold to that understanding until I became a dispensational teacher. And in dispensational teaching, we are clear about what pertains to Israel and what pertains to the church. Israel under the law and the church under grace. So divorce for immorality in the context of the Jewish wedding protocol is what is talked about in Matthew 19:9, and is most probably talking about this Jewish marriage. The couple was considered married, but did not live with one another, had no sexual relations for about 1 year. And if during that time the woman became pregnant, the man could divorce her for immorality. And that's what's talked about in Matthew 19:9. So Jesus here is speaking to the Jews and in the context of Jewish marriage. So just think Joseph and Mary when you think about this and how that story unfolds. Verse 12, but to the rest I say, not to the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. So to the rest, this is married people, again, and Paul is saying this from his apostolic authority, that if a believing man has a wife who is an unbeliever, and we know that she is an unbeliever by the Greek word for unbeliever is apistos, not believing. And she consents to live with him in his house as his wife, he must not divorce her, not send her away. He could give her the gospel and she could get saved. She is made holy by living with a believer, and the children are also considered holy. In other words, they're going to have an opportunity to hear the gospel, see the gospel lived out, and possibly be saved as a result of being married to a believer. Verse 13, and a woman who has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, she must not send her husband away. So here's how that works. Verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified. He has contact with the truth through his believing wife, and the unbelieving wife is brought into contact with the truth through her believing husband. The truth being that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and that there is no coming to the Father except through Jesus Christ and trusting in what he has done for them. So otherwise, it says your children, and these are not tiny babies, these are what's called technos, and those are ones that are old enough to understand. So these must be children that are maybe 5 or 6 years old. They're able to have a conversation and to understand some concepts here. The children are unclean, for otherwise your children are unclean. So if you divorce, it leaves them in darkness rather than giving them the light. But now they are holy. If you remain married, the children have an opportunity now to be exposed to the truth. By the way, Roman law gave the children of a divorce always to the father and never to the mother. And so this is kind of an interesting thing, because today in our society it's almost always to the mother and not to the father. Verse 15, yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. So if the unbelieving person in the marriage separates by divorce, the rule is let them leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. You're not obligated to try and stop them. But God has called us to peace, harmonious relations with the unbeliever who divorces. But it says nothing about remarriage here. The believer must remain unmarried or reconcile with them. So if you're married to an unbeliever and the unbeliever leaves, divorces you, that is not permission to remarry again. So it's the same rule. They're to remain unmarried unless they can reconcile with the one who left. Verse 16, for how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? So there it is. It's God may use you as the means of presenting the gospel to this unsaved person who is elect and has been chosen by God so that they can believe and be saved. He may be using you in that situation. Verse 17, only as the Lord has assigned each one, as God has called each in this manner, let him walk, and so I direct in all the churches. So assigned means to be placed in a position, and God does place us in positions, and he has called each one how he is to walk or how he is to live. And so I direct this in all churches. So stay where you are is the guiding principle. If you're married, stay married. If you're divorced, stay divorced or reconcile. If widowed, stay widowed, or you can remarry. If married to an unbeliever, stay married. If an unbeliever divorces, let them go in peace. The believer is to remain divorced or reconcile. So that's the rules coming out of those first 17 verses. Now, verse 18, was any man called when he was already circumcised? He's not to become uncircumcised. Has anyone been called in uncircumcision? He's not to be circumcised. He's talking about here if a man was a Jew. This is the circumcision is a part of the Mosaic law, the ritual cutting away of the foreskin of a male by Jewish law, peritemno. He is not to become uncircumcised. And has anyone been called as a Gentile? Don't try to become a Jew. In other words, a Jew shouldn't try to become a Gentile. A Gentile shouldn't try to become a Jew. This became real obvious in these Olympic games that they had there, because in the competition, the men ran naked. It was obvious whether this person was circumcised or uncircumcised. And some of the circumcised had actually tried to figure out a way to do some kind of a surgical procedure to make it look like they were not. Verse 19, circumcision is nothing, uncircumcision is nothing, but the keeping of the commandments of God. So this idea of circumcision in the church age is of absolutely no importance. It was hugely important under the law of the Jews, but we are not under that law, so it's of no importance to us. So uncircumcision is nothing. Neither one makes any difference. What matters is the obeying of the commandments of God. And so this is an excellent verse to explain the dispensational shift from the law of Moses to the law of Christ in the church. The law of Christ is given as a principle beginning in the upper room discourse, that's John 13 through 17, and it is completed in the writing of the epistles. That law is given under grace. The Holy Spirit makes it possible to obey the law of Christ as we walk in the Spirit rather than in the flesh. Romans 8 is a great chapter for explaining this very thing. Verse 20, each man must remain in that condition in which he was called. So Jews, don't try to become Gentiles. Gentiles, don't try to become Jews. The church is considered to be one new man. It's Jews and Gentiles, males and females. That's all considered to be one new man in the church. Verse 21, were you called while a slave? Do not worry about it, but if you're able also to become free, do that. So this is in service to another, a doulos, and you should not think about American black slavery when you see this word, because in the Roman Empire, nearly half of the population of the Roman Empire were slaves. Some of these are voluntary. In fact, the majority of them were voluntary, and they were people who held high positions, doctors, teachers, lawyers, and so forth. But they had become a slave or sold themselves to a wealthy patron, master, to basically serve them. So don't conflate black American slavery with this. Slavery here in America was the sin of kidnapping. And people were basically kidnapped from their place and then forced into labor in another place. During this time that this is written, you had the Roman army, when they captured someone, they might take some into slavery, make them work for the Roman Empire, forced them to work. But the majority of them, as I said, were people who voluntarily chose to be a slave because it was a really good life. And they were not mistreated or beaten. They had plenty of food, shelter, and all of those kinds of things. Treated very, very well. Verse 22, for he who was called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. And likewise, he who was called while free is Christ's slave. So interesting, if you're called in the Lord while you're a slave, you're now the Lord's freedman. In other words, when you believe the gospel, if you were a slave and you believe the gospel, you now become what's called the Lord's freedman. You are spiritually free from Satan and sin as your master, pelutheros. And likewise, he who was called while free is now Christ's slave. So a voluntary slave, and you're now a slave to righteousness rather than a slave to sin. Verse 23, you were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. So this is the idea of expiation. It's Christ's blood bought us out of the slave market of sin. Each of us was bought out. So here's a picture of the cross. And the cross basically, when you think about it, did a couple of things between God and man. It propitiated the wrath of God towards sin. In other words, it satisfied God's wrath. Christ's death on the cross satisfied the sin debt of men from all time, satisfied God's wrath so that he is now free to lavish grace and love on the people who once were apart from him, who were his enemies. And the other thing for man is we are now able to reconcile with God through Christ. That's what Christ was doing. He was reconciling men to God by the cross. And this is the idea of redemption. The cross is redemption. This is the price paid to buy a slave out of a slave market. We were in the slave market of sin, and by Christ's death on the cross, we were bought out. So we have been bought with a price. So don't sell yourselves to men. Verse 24, brethren, each one is to remain with God in that condition in which he was called. So be content to live out your calling. Your social status means absolutely nothing to God. And I just wanted to take 1 minute to talk about the divine institutions, because we're talking about marriage here. Marriage is just an absolute fundamental of any kind of a civil society. And these blocks I've shown you here are what's called the divine institutions of God. So these first three, I'm starting from the bottom, responsible, labor, marriage, and family, those were given by God pre-flood. They're given to all people, every person, nation, tribe, or tongue. These three things apply to you. Marriage being a critical piece of this. If marriage cracks, you can see that the family's not going to do very well. And I think you see also from splits in family, you see people, especially the children, suffer tremendously from that. So after the flood, God added two more divine institutions. One's called government, and he gave government capital punishment as a means of stopping men from killing one another. And then the idea of nations. So this is borders, language, and culture. Again, God doesn't deal with skin color. We call that race today. He's not interested in black, white, brown, yellow, whatever it is. That skin color is something that must have been in the DNA of Adam and Eve, passed on through Seth, passed on through Noah and his sons and their wives, so that as the nations were split apart and based on the geographical locations that they're in, certain things changed. And so if you were a lily white person, now that you're in a sun area, you're probably going to have a skin color change. You're going to get darker as a result of that because of the melatonin in the skin. But the church should never consider these things about black and white and so forth. Shouldn't fall into the trap of this thing that's called systemic racism. This is critical race theory where white people are always guilty, and we're guilty because of slavery, and we have white privilege, and we need to be making things right with black people, paying reparations and that kind of thing. Bible never ever addresses any of that kind of stuff. This is man-made. Racism is man-made, and this idea of paying reparations to black people is a man-made idea. It's not a biblical idea. Some applications from 1 Corinthians 7, those who are married. The scriptural doctrine of marriage between two Christians is that when it is consummated, it is a binding contract from which there is no divorce. Now, divorces do happen, and the great thing about our God is this is a time of grace. If you have divorced and you're remarried to someone, that is a sin, and you should confess that sin to God, 1 John 1:9, and then you should live in that new marriage that you have as if it is the only one, and stay with that. So, but the teaching is no divorce. If a wife does divorce, she's to remain unmarried or to reconcile with her original husband. And if there's no divorce for the husband, because he's the spiritual head of his wife, and he also, if there's a divorce, must remain unmarried or reconcile. The vows of the marriage require the man and woman to have regular sexual intercourse as part of the marriage contract, and it says that their bodies belong to each other. Sexual relations for married couples are not to be withheld unless there's mutual agreement for the purpose of prayer and for a short period of time only. A widow or widower may choose to not remarry so as to devote themselves to full service to the Lord, or they can remarry if they wish. The marriage contract is over at the death of either one of those people. A believer married to an unbeliever is not to divorce them, but if they consent to stay, and if they don't, let the unbeliever leave. But the believer must not remarry or must reconcile with the unbeliever. They're still bound under the marriage contract, even if you made the mistake of marrying an unbeliever. On to verse 25. This is some doctrine for the unmarried. And it's rather odd because there's something going on in Corinth which has triggered a question here. And Paul is sort of responding to this in terms of some crisis in Corinth. So verse 25 says, now concerning, which means here's a new topic coming. I have no command of the Lord about virgins. I have no command of the Lord, but I give an opinion. So he's given his advice as one who by the mercy of the Lord is trustworthy. So you should listen to this, pay attention to it. It's advice. You don't have to follow it, but if you do, that would make sense. So virgins here it's the word parthenos, and it means unmarried persons. In context, it's both male and female. It's typically used of female who is unmarried. He says, I have no command. Jesus never addressed this in any of the Gospels, but he says, that's why I'm giving you my opinion. And Paul gives his apostolic inspired opinion. And so he is trustworthy. He's faithful to the Lord. So you should pay attention, close attention to this. Verse 26, I think that it is good in view of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. So there's something going on in Corinth. We don't know what that is. The Corinthians knew, Paul knew. We just don't have the context here to understand what it was that happened. And so Paul says, I think then that it is good, it's advantageous or better in view of this present distress or crisis, for a man to remain as he is. So if a man is unmarried, he's a virgin in that sense, he should remain as he is, unmarried. In other words, the distress, whatever it is, would be compounded if he was married. So some kind of crisis in Corinth, both Paul and the Corinthians, they knew about this, but we don't have any information on that. This advice from Paul is specific to that church at that specific time, and it was temporary until this distress ended. So that's why I'm not really going to make any kinds of applications for us today, because this doesn't really apply. 27, are you bound to a wife? Then do not seek to be released. Are you released from a wife? Don't seek a wife. So are you bound in a marriage contract? Then don't seek a divorce because of this crisis. If you're released from a wife, don't go trying to find another wife. So if married, stay married. If single, stay single. Verse 28, but if you marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Yet such will have trouble in this life, and I am trying to spare you. So something's going on. If you marry the man who was never married, you have not sinned. You haven't missed the mark if you do. And if a virgin woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet such will have trouble. There's going to be suffering in general, probably a specific kind of suffering as a result of this crisis. Paul's trying to spare them of that. He's addressing this specific distress in Corinth, and this is not to be applied to other churches today. The norm today is marriage unless you have the gift of celibacy. So part of the context here also is that the legalists in Corinth are telling virgins not to marry so that they can be more spiritual by celibacy. And Paul is suggesting not marrying because of the current crisis. So these are two different things. When that crisis ends, of course, marriage becomes the normal state again. And then he talks about some eschatological living priorities, end times kinds of living priorities. But this I say, brethren, the time has been shortened, so that from now on those who have wives should be as though they had none. So this is the time, the first coming until the rapture of the church, the second coming, has been shortened. That time is shortened. Now that the church age has begun, that time is becoming short. And this is talking about this eschatological time period between the first and second coming. It's a contracted period now. And even now, those who have wives should be as though they had none. Church age has no set duration. It could end at any moment. It's been going now for almost 2,000 years. But what is the theology here is that the rapture of the church, the end of the church age, is imminent. And it will happen at some sudden time. It will be over. But his advice to these who have wives, act as though you had none, it is kind of difficult to understand, and we can only kind of try and see it from Paul's perspective, that it has something to do with that present distress. But other than that, I can't comment on it. Verse 30, and those who weep as though they did not weep, those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, those who buy as though they did not possess. So remember, the Lord's coming for us very soon. It's imminent. So if you rejoice, this is a serious time as we wait, but we are always full of joy waiting for the Lord. And those who buy as though they did not possess, don't get so materialistic during this time, because everything here is going to stay here. All your physical belongings will stay here. Verse 31, and those who use the world as though they did not make full use of it, for the form of this world is passing away. Remembering we are citizens of heaven first, and all of our blessings are heavenly blessings. This is Ephesians 1, verse 3 through about verse 18. We have all these heavenly blessings. We're not necessarily blessed in this world. Can be blessed, could have a good life going, and you could have money and a home and all of those things, but that's not a promise to us from Scripture to the church. Don't get too attached here, I think, is basically what it's saying, because this world is passing away. So the rapture is imminent. The world will have a different form in the kingdom when Christ returns at his second coming. He will set up his kingdom, and that kingdom is going to have a different form than the form today. And Christ and the church will rule and reign in righteousness in that kingdom. Verse 32, I want you to be free from concern. One who's unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. So don't just be without worry. Paul sees this as the desirable state. Wrote a whole book on having joy, by the way. It's the book of Philippians. And if you're struggling with having joy today, then read the book of Philippians. Paul sees this as a desirable state. He didn't have a wife and kids, so all his time he was free to travel, evangelize, train, go to the next location. He was tremendous. He had tremendous freedom to use his time for the Lord's work. So I think that's kind of what he's saying here. Verse 33, but one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. Yes, of course, marriage requires time and attention. The husband must have a job, provide a home, and be the spiritual leader of his wife and his kids. So his time is pretty much taken up in these kinds of things. He's not free to travel around like Paul was. Verse 34, and it says his interests are divided. When I strike something through like that, his interest is not in the text. When you see that line through a couple of words, it means it's not in the original text. So the woman who is unmarried and the virgin is concerned about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy in body and spirit. But one who is married is concerned about the things of the world and how she may please her husband. So it's this the flip side of the husband. So obviously time has to be taken for a healthy marriage. So that time gets split between the spouse and family, and time for study and service. And so you're not available full-time to do some of these things. So he's talking about, again, the unmarried, the never married. They can devote more time to the things of the Lord if they remain that way. Verse 35, this I say to your own benefit, not to put a restraint on you, but to promote what is appropriate and to secure undistracted devotion to the Lord. So this is for a benefit for you, not like the legalists who are putting these restraints or leashes on people, but to promote what is appropriate and to secure undistracted devotion So this is genuine freedom to serve the Lord. So serving the Lord involves the evangelism and discipleship is what the Lord wants his church doing until he comes today. The church is not the social justice end of the business here on this world. The Lord's going to handle that when he comes back. Government, Romans 13, is to restrain evil and promote good for the unbelieving world. The church should be able to manage itself, but the church even submits to the government. But it is not our job to go out and clean up the world. We are to evangelize people to try and offer them a way out of this current dark world and enter into the kingdom of light by trusting in Jesus Christ. That's the message of the gospel. So since Acts 2, birth of the church, the doctrine of the rapture of the church is imminent. It's been nearly 2,000 years as Christ is building his church. His church is going to be completed when the last Gentile comes to faith, and the rapture will happen without any warning. Where we are in our spiritual growth and maturity will be how we appear at the Bema Seat judgment of rewards. And anticipating that day should really motivate us so we would not find ourselves to be ashamed of the life we have lived. Verse 36, but if any man thinks he's acting unbecomingly toward his virgin daughter, if she is past her youth, and if it must be so, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin. This is an interesting verse because the NIV translates it as a man, a potential suitor or something. But in context, it can't be that. It has to be the father. The father is how he acts toward his virgin daughter. So that's the way I would read this. But if any father thinks that he is acting preparing to disgrace or disgracing his actions toward his virgin daughter, if she's past her youth, so she's sort of like not in that marriageable age range, and if it must be so, let him do what he wishes. In other words, he could arrange a marriage for her, and he doesn't sin. He says, let them marry. That translation of her is incorrect, should be them. Let them marry. So arrange a marriage and get her married. That's one thing that he could do. But he who stands firm in his heart, and this is that father again, stands firm in his heart, having no constraint, but has authority over his own will and has decided in his own heart to keep his own virgin daughter, he'll do well. So this father says, no, I'm just settled in my mind. I'm comfortable with this. He's decided that in his own heart, he will not give his daughter in marriage. He will keep her there in the house. It says that he does well. So maybe she has no interest in getting married. Maybe she has the gift of celibacy. She's just not interested in doing that. She would rather stay in the house and help her mom and dad, and that's fine. Verse 38, so then both he who gives his own virgin daughter in marriage does well, and he who does not give her in marriage will do better. So that's just a comment on the last two situations. One daughter has shown an interest perhaps in getting married, and one is not. So not giving the daughter who has the gift of celibacy in marriage is better. Again, this seems to be in response to this crisis at the time. So verse 39, a wife is bound as long as her husband lives, but if her husband's dead, she's free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. So we understand that the legal contract of the marriage ends at the death of one of the spouses. And then it says that if it's the woman who's left, the husband dies and the woman is left, that she is free to marry, but she must marry a believer. Widower who chooses to remarry is to remarry a Christian. And then the last verse, verse 40. But in my opinion, she is happier if she remains as she is. Again, that's the kind of remain in that state of unmarried, because it gives her an opportunity to do a lot of things for the Lord. He says, and I think that I also have the Spirit of God. He's deducing this from his apostolic viewpoint, his mind apostolic viewpoint, and from the previous scriptures that he has read. This is his deduction from that. So that's chapter 7, quite a long chapter, but an interesting one about marriage and divorce. And I think the Lord would not be particularly happy with the church today, since, like I said at the beginning, there's something like statistics indicate 50% or so of the church has divorced. And so maybe it's just because we don't have very strong teaching on these subjects. But now you know, and if you have divorced and you're remarried, just remember our God is merciful and gracious to you. Confess your sin, and then make it your absolute devotion to your husband, or husbands to the wife in this second marriage, to live with them and to fulfill all of the things that the marriage contract requires. And that's it for today.